conversation when I was sort of when I was pitching Brum Tapas and the whole thing, and we were looking for speakers, and we had a conversation about her work and about what she wrote her doctorate in, and a lot of it was really about comparisons between what we see in the tech industry. So in the tech industry in the West Midlands, it's very siloed, where we have these people do this, the startup scene do this, these people do this, and collaboration is extremely hard. And I think any of the other sort of the tech organizations that overarch the city will say exactly the same thing, that getting collaboration is really, really hard. So talking to Victoria about her work, it was really apparent that the same problems exist in the creative industries about how you get collaboration. But really, from what Victoria was saying about the academic work she writes on, is that it's more than just the collaboration. It's how do you measure? How does anybody measure in tech our collaboration across products or across launching services? There's an economic value to it. There's something can be measured in money or revenue, etc. But when it's creative arts, how do you measure the topography of a city, or how do you measure the cultural impact that is created from people that are collaborating together? So on that note, here to speak about her work as a creative ecosystems researcher, please welcome to the stage, everybody, Dr. Victoria.
Hello, thank you very much for the welcome and for the invite in the first place. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If not, I'm sure I'll get a nudge. But I am Victoria, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I currently work at Coventry University, although I haven't actually been there for the entire time on my contract. So you probably pick up that I'm a bit of an outsider to the West Midlands as well. I'm from Derby, but please don't hold that against me. And I did all my study at Warwick and Coventry universities, and I also spent a year as part of my PhD, as James has said, doing some first-hand research into the creative ecosystem in the West Midlands. So I have taken some of that outside-in perspective, but it's really great to have been invited to talk about that, as well as hearing from some of the other brilliant speakers who actually make the creative ecosystem happen in reality. And I went into academic research in this area because I'd always really enjoyed the arts and theatre, and in fact my first degree was in theatre studies, but I realised that I had no performance talent to make a living from, so I wanted to find out more about how the business end of that really worked. And it also seemed really fascinating to me that there's this really engaging and meaningful creative area of work that connects people through experience. And that needs managing in a really careful way so that those important values around people and bringing them together can be shared. And also, as I've gone along, there's more that I've discovered that I'm interested in about how that works in different places and at different scales. So whether that's hyperlocal or whether it's national and international, and supporting education and having infrastructure and so on. So my research now is about the creative economy and place. So I look at the networks and collaborations that make creative work happen. I'm really interested in the values that drive creative people and their work. And I'm also interested in how both of those change depending on particular places. And that idea of place, I've developed an interest over time in the theory side of it, but that's perhaps a bit esoteric and deep and meaningful, so I won't go into it too much, but it changes and that's fascinating. So I use the idea of creative ecosystem, firstly as a way of describing all of that, just to bring it together, but secondly as a way of constructing the research that I do. I'm working currently on projects around creative freelancers and their business models, inevitably how they've been impacted by the last year's circumstances, and also recently finished one on artists' perceptions of how place shapes their work and their creativity. I've worked as an evaluator on a whole range of sort of creative and arts projects over the past 6 years or so, and I'm also a director of a community interest company called Shed, which takes a flat pack, multi-format shed out to various places. We've been to car parks, we've been to marketplaces, and we set up and we host artistic and participatory events, and we try to spark conversations with communities about what's meaningful to them and what's important, what they'd like to change. So I do come from more of that arts and culture side and background. And over the next 20 minutes or so, what I won't be doing, because I can't for reasons that will become clear, is show you a single picture of Birmingham's creative ecosystem, or anywhere else for that matter. And that's because I really see the creative ecosystem as what you experience and what you develop in your work and your business and generally how you go about your lives. And that's my perspective on it in practice. And you know how that works much better than I do. And the other reason for not coming in and presenting that to you as a fait accompli is that I don't think that's the right thing to do. I don't think researchers should turn up and say, I've got the answers to this. I'm very much about learning as a researcher from the way that the world works. And that's my kind of conceptual approach to it, if you like. So what I would like to do is tell you a bit about how my research got me to my particular understanding of creative ecosystem. And some of the questions that I'm still interested in exploring. So if you are short on time or you were hoping to just nip off for a drinks break for this, then the short version is that the creative ecosystem is a useful heuristic technique. And that means it's a thing that lets us shortcut the complicated bits of decision making or understanding and to really have a shared consensus. And it means that we know we're not starting from a perfect approach, but what we have got is good enough as an approximation for talking about a problem or a situation. So I can say creative ecosystem, you can hear that, and we're broadly on the same page to start talking about similar things. So through the research that I've done, I've tried to unpack that in a bit more detail. And what it's boiled down to for me is 6 elements, which hopefully you can see here. And they cover a range of things that need to exist in some form or other in order for there to be a healthy or at least a functioning ecosystem in a given place. And they go from less tangible but really important things like strategies and policy initiatives, and also the funding and investment that needs to be there but is not the main thing, to the infrastructure that lets us make work and get around. So that's physical infrastructure like cultural buildings and transport systems to get us to and from them. And it's also digital infrastructure like broadband systems and services and the means to communicate with each other. So those top three elements really relate to place in the way that I think about it. And then the other 3 are more related to people. So obviously we've got creatives, we've got independent organisations, we've got artists who make work or products or services, whatever that might be. And then that needs an audience or a customer of some kind. And within that, I think it's really important to include communities who may or may not be directly engaged at that point with your kind of creative process. And then last but by no means least is all the kind of education and training and skills and probably networks that need to be there before, during and after any kind of creative activity so that you can sustain that ecosystem going forward. And so that all started in 2015. And actually, if I'd been aware of independent Birmingham and the work that was going on there at that point, it would have made my PhD a lot easier. But we live and learn. So I was really lucky and I got a studentship to do some research into the journey from arts ecology to creative economy. And I started by reading a lot because that's what you do. And I ended up getting really frustrated by all the kind of national policy and all the research that talked about creative entrepreneurship and how it needed to grow and make money, and that was the whole point of running a business, and all the national statistics that talked about how much money the creative industries made every year. And don't worry, I will get back to those, but I got stuck into trying to dismantle the idea that you really had to go from an ecology to an economy, because that didn't seem that simple. It didn't seem to make sense to me. So I came across this idea of a cultural and creative ecosystem that recognised the commercial aspects and the kind of money-making imperative in creative businesses, but also took into account those other kind of value-generating activities that didn't come with a pound sign, whether that was social or cultural or environmental. And although the phrase ecosystem was being bandied around, it's obviously a technical term, there wasn't a fixed model of it, and there wasn't a single definition even that everybody was signing up to. So my research started by looking at other kinds of ecosystem in business and in industry publication, so that I could investigate that using creative ecosystem or creative industry data. And I wanted to forge ahead with that because it really felt like ecosystem had something to offer to stretch thinking beyond just a value chain or a production chain approach. So at its most simple, then the ecosystem is it's creative people, and it's an environment, and it's the links between the two. And that builds on the idea that cultural and creative sectors are really intertwined with lots of other sectors. And there's a quote from another academic called Justin O'Connor, who says, the creative industries operate within a complex ecosystem that involves not just artists and business people, but almost every area of urban life. So it's a bit of a catch-all, but it really chimed with the way that I'd experienced creative industries and theatre and arts, and the focus that I wanted to take in my research. So I am going to say a little bit more about how UK policy has focused on creative industries and their huge financial growth. And the thing we track in doing that, those pound signs, that thing hasn't changed in the last 24 or so years, but does it really measure and value everything that's important? Has to be said, the methods for working out those numbers has changed, but that's another presentation. It's really complicated. But I want to rewind a bit to how I got to my ecosystem debate and the background to that. And I've done a little bit of thinking about how Birmingham looks in that regard. So I'll share that with you, but it's by no means complete, and it's definitely that outside in perspective. But then I'll come back to the kind of ecosystem overall and my ongoing questions. So in general terms, then, this idea of the creative industries, it came about as part of a shift from arts and culture to culture and creative activity being seen as industry sectors in their own right. And I'm going to say it was around the 1940s, but it's a movable feast. But around the 1940s, there was also a load of criticism of that because it focused on mass production, and the criticism was that kind of demeaned the high values of culture, and it was just it was dumbing down, I guess, would be the contemporary parallel. It was turning culture and art into a kind of a sausage factory approach, and that wasn't good enough because it demeaned the values in it in the first place. So there's lots of research and debate around who benefits from that sort of approach, and highbrow and lowbrow approaches, to use horrible shorthand. But that move through to this kind of industrial and production focused approach led then to particular ways of seeing the value of those bits of what became the economy. And then you get skipping forward to the 80s and 90s, there was a real growth in the use of that sector. So Jim alluded to it in the introduction, creativity became a kind of lever in lots of places for urban regeneration, alongside a growth in technology and processing power and capabilities. And I'm paraphrasing quite a lot, obviously, but that led to huge changes in who could make culture and who could access creative products, and different ways of thinking about business models that came out of that, including a focus on intellectual property. And then we fast forward again to the late 90s, which was a critical time for the creative industries, although a number of things happened at this point. So I just wanted to put us all in the 1997 zone. So the BBC News online service launched as a kind of round-the-clock thing. Grand Theft Auto came out in one of its early iterations. The Teletubbies and Channel 5 burst onto the screens. Some book came out that I think they've made into a film. Just over there, that's Derby County Stadium. Dolly the Sheep was hatched, and various forms of music. Don't judge me on my musical taste. But the main thing I want to use for this particular purpose is the Labour general election victory in May 1997, and as well as their manifesto slogan about education, they had their sights set on that intellectual property approach to what came to be called the creative industries. So they set up this creative industries task force, and then they, over the next year or so, produced a mapping document that set out what they defined as this set of industry sectors and started to come up with ways of measuring them. There's been some really interesting work done in the last year or so which looked at how that came about, and it has to be said they kind of made it up as they went along, but it obviously stuck because they came up with these industry sectors and they measured them, and this is the the gross value added in billions of pounds that the creative industries gave to the UK over time. So in terms of dividing it up into sectors, it went from advertising and marketing, it included architecture. For a while it included art and antiques, and then that got moved. Crafts is always a kind of low level because of the way that they count things. Design, fashion, film, TV, video, etc. IT, software and computer services always flying the flag, but it caused lots of arguments about what was really creative and what was counted. And then museums was the last one, next to music and visual arts and performing arts. So as a kind of race through those changes in economic contribution over time, but it shows you how significant the creative industries are and why they're still interesting to policymakers. And I've just put those areas of the ecosystem as I see it here again to give you a sense of where certain things slot in and the questions that prompts for me, particularly in Birmingham. So from the 90s, and in fact before, as Jim said in his introduction, there've been really clear strategies that focus on the creative sector in the city and as a way to change external perspectives and encourage investment. And that goes right back to regional development agencies. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of them or remembers those, but they had a real strategic focus on digital and screen media. And then from a finance and investment perspective, there's been, from 2001, for about 10 years or so, there's been about 15 million of European and local authority funding ploughed into various things. There's obviously the Commonwealth Games coming in as a form of investment and interest. On the flip side, it has been pointed out that West Midlands creative businesses do less well in the number and the success rate of their applications for public funding. And I know that I'm switching between Birmingham and West Midlands quite a lot, but there's a learning point for me in that the data across those things isn't always comparable or available all the time. But in relation to infrastructure then, there's been tons going on, as you will know much better than me, but Custard Factory was one of the big flagship things for creative industries, as well as initiatives like Steam House, which has got lots of support from Birmingham City University in particular, which leads us through to education. And there's universities, there's colleges, there's creative startup and there's creative scale-up programs in the mix. And from the perspectives of individuals working in the sector, this is based on 2015 data, but there were around 5,000 businesses in the creative industries in the Greater Birmingham and Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership area. So it's a different type of geography, but still relevant. And over half of those were in IT, software and computer services. And as with the creative industries and the UK profile of business as a whole, around 94% of those were micro enterprises, which was the focus of my PhD research. A micro enterprise has fewer than 10 employees. This doesn't take into account freelancers and independent artists and people doing stuff in their spare time while they've got a salaried job to pay bills. But on the employment side, there were 27,500 jobs in the creative industries in 2015. And that had grown quite a bit over the past 5 years, but not as much as other areas of the country. And around 14,000 of those jobs were in IT and software. And again, that had grown 10% in the last 5 years, but not as much as other places in the country where it had grown about 32% on average. And then moving over to an audience and a community perspective, there's a view arts-wise that audiences often come from outside the city, which is a challenge, but it means that there's a potential for arts venues and practitioners to more effectively reach communities within the city, potentially. And I'll perhaps say a bit more about audience and community connections in relation to my own work now. But for this, I've just drawn out some of the more easily accessible numbers. And it's quite a high level, and it wasn't at all put together at 10 o'clock last night. But there's a suggestion in looking at that as a whole that Birmingham's creative ecosystem has definitely had significant policy interests, and funding has been pumped into regeneration and to infrastructure. There's this whole raft of education-related activity, but the city might be punching below its weight in terms of its creative community, and it could potentially reach more and different audiences and communities. And that might ring true with you, it might not, but it illustrates the structure that I use to think around an ecosystem and also the connections between those elements. So I've already explained why I wanted to explore ecosystem itself, because it stretches beyond kind of this financial value frame and connects to issues around cultural value in a better way for me. But I'll just say a little bit about how I approached my research to give you a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of the questions that I've still got about it. So I did my research in the West Midlands in 2016, which is kind of similar time to when the combined authority approaches and their strategies focused on creative industries was coming out. And I took national data on the creative industries and I tried to slot that into existing non-creative models of ecosystem to see what that looks like. And it's described here as top-down, but outside-in might be just as good a way of describing it. And I wanted to see whether the creative sector really fit into entrepreneurial models of an ecosystem or organisational development models. And spoiler alert, no, not really. It did give a certain perspective, but it couldn't really get into the detail of networks and micro enterprises that are that huge proportion of the creative industries. So I went bottom up or inside out, whichever way you want to look at it. And I created a number of really detailed case studies of micro enterprises in Birmingham. I interviewed the owners and the operators of those businesses and looked through their accounts, not in a forensic way, but I wanted to see where and how they were connected to different bits of what I thought might be the ecosystem over time. And that time thing was really important as well. And that gave a richer sense of the journey of those businesses and the paths that they'd taken, whether that was by design or just by circumstance. And so the need to have kind of top-down and bottom-up perspectives is something that I'm writing up at the moment elsewhere. But the blending of the two gave a much more detailed and a different perspective that you just wouldn't have got with one or the other. And another thing that came out of both of those perspectives was this idea that the creative ecosystem is a different shape and it's a different experience for everybody. Hence me saying at the start that I wouldn't be giving you a fixed picture of what this was. But all of those different experiences and the journeys make up the bigger ecosystem, and it's the richer for it. So, more is more. And also, all of those individuals and those businesses that I spoke to had got connections from the hyperlocal right through to the international. And taking any work forward, I think, really needs to recognise that range of connections and the diversity of experience. So I should also say the 6 areas that I'm working with now came out of workshopping this concept with a local authority who are not in the West Midlands, but making it a better fit to their needs and understanding from an arts and culture perspective particularly. And I've since gone back and reflected on where that's been useful and where there are issues. And I'm actually heading straight off from this event to speak about that at a conference in Japan. Sadly, also from the cupboard under the stairs, not actually in Japan. But there are a few things coming up for me in terms of what next that I've, again, pegged on to different areas of the ecosystem to just give it some structure. So from a strategy perspective, in the areas that I work, there's a lot being talked about co-creation in strategic terms, and there's also, as you would expect, lots of discussion about building back and how that's focused on place, and there's lots of chat that I'm kind of sort of involved in some places about what culture can do to kind of reinvigorate the high street if retail is going to be struggling as much as it has been. And that leads to lots of different funding and investment possibilities. But also from a research point of view, that's also talking a lot more about collaboration and trust-based networks, which I know is familiar to lots of you, but gives opportunities for these sort of interdisciplinary collaborative approaches. But the ways of doing that have kind of been thrust upon us in one sense. So digital has been accelerated by the circumstances we're in, and we're more digital than lots of us thought we could be. So our view of the infrastructure has probably changed, but I think it's also true to say that that's not the same for everybody. And there's work to do to make that feasible for people to continue in this sort of blended or hybrid way. Universities are really engaged in that, and I think there are more opportunities for all of us to get stuck into that as part of the knowledge exchange agenda, because, as I said, my perspective as a researcher is I've got more to learn than I have to teach. And I think that's true of universities as well, but I'm not sure they would all agree with me. But on that, I think I'd also throw in something really important that I'm interested in about the value of arts and humanities subjects before we lose them because they're not profitable. So they underpin a lot of the creative work that happens. And on artists and creatives and the workforce, there's not just that kind of underpinning education. There's an issue of, how on earth will the system change to give opportunities back to groups of people like freelancers who have seen their work damaged or completely destroyed over the last year. And then finally, but again, by no means least, there are the audiences and the communities that we need to consider in the future. And there are two things here that I'm particularly interested in. The first of those is a more literal notion of ecosystem and the environment as a focus of work, because we all have this wider responsibility to the places that we live and work to sustain them for the future. And also the second thing, in shaping what we do from now, we need to listen more to the voices that haven't had the chance to take part and to be more equitable in how we do that, which then brings us back to co-creation as a principle and a strategy. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of those components and the ways that they're intertwined. And these complex ecosystems have often grown organically, but that doesn't mean that we can't intervene to change things. And so to do that, we need to understand who has the commercial drivers and who has those wider or different cultural and social drivers. So having said I would talk about how it works in practice, there are a couple of things just to finish up. One is that the connections between things are often as important, if not more important, than the things themselves. And any business or individual can use these areas to think through who you're connected to and how that can help drive your work forward and how to build a richer ecosystem in the place that you live and work. But again, I think it's also important to think about who you're not connected to and who's not in that picture and who doesn't get chance to maximise their connections because they can't break into a network. And just because ecosystem sounds nice and fluffy and ecological doesn't mean it's inclusive. Anything you're putting a boundary round acts as a barrier to the person on the other side. So if you are clued up about this and you do have good connections, then that's great. And who can you pass your hand to bring along with you next? Because a creative ecosystem is not owned by or the responsibility of any one individual or organisation. It thrives when there are passionate people in it who are driving their work forward based on values and who are making connections. And yes, of course, there's a need to fund that somehow, but you will know very well it's not by sitting back and being passive that things get done and that change gets made. And I think that's abundantly clear from all the speakers in this lineup this evening, which is where I will stop and let you hear from the rest of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I love there was some great sort of closing points on there that really sort of rang true. I mean, for us in the tech ecosystem, and then for the other people in the other people in the arts as well. That was really fascinating. I've got like a page of notes, but I think the audience take priority over me. So we do have some. Here we go. We do have some questions.
Oh, wow. Okay. If I wanted to read your research on how place affects creative ecosystems, where could I find it? You can find my thesis in the British Library, but good luck to you with that one. I am currently finishing off a paper which is about the kind of top-down, bottom-up approach and how that applies. So who knows if that gets accepted. I will certainly let you know. I think probably what I ought to do is just write my own stuff up as a blog probably and get that out there. Currently I'm at Coventry University and some of my project kind of write-ups are on the Coventry University Research blog. I think it's called Curb. So is there
the thesis at the British Library, is there a digitalised version of it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I think the thesis repository is called Ethos. So anybody who's done a thesis in the last, 20 years, maybe, they're in there, accessible to people. But really what I need to do is write it and publish it more. So the slide that I didn't put up was just my Twitter handle. So if people find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, then I can always share things as I publish.
I think we might be able to get a pop up, or at least we should be able to get a pop up with your Twitter handle on there, so that we can consume things the modern way. Not the official academic way, old dusty papers. This is one of my questions.
Okay, which cities and regions do you think are doing a really good job of investing in creative industries, and who can we learn from? There's lots of places who are really interested in it, and they're all doing it differently, which actually I guess is the point, because they should all be doing it differently. There's something called the Preston model. I don't know if you've heard of that. It wasn't specifically creative industries, but it's a really interesting kind of focus on the local.
That rings a vague bell.
It was all about how the local authority should prioritise local suppliers and provide all the things. So I think that's quite interesting, in the same way as in sort of a values-based approach. I mean, I'm not saying it because I work for the university, but I think Coventry is doing interesting things. I don't know if everybody in Coventry's, well, in fact I do. I know that not everybody in Coventry's creative community agrees with how things are happening. I think probably Glasgow is quite a good place to look at for how they've publicised certainly their kind of investment and the priorities there.
Well, which actually the part of the question actually matters. Sort of the first one I want to know is who's doing it well. You mentioned Glasgow. I mean, Edinburgh is supposed to be famous for its indie scene, which obviously ties in with what Joe was saying. But have you ever had a chance to look at Edinburgh as well? Maybe
not in a policy sense. No, I mean the work that I finished my PhD in 2018. So I'm still in the stages of writing up that, which means that most of my focus is on the English Midlands at the moment. But it's a great question, and it's certainly something that I want to explore further. And I'm just trying to wrap my brains for I don't think there is one city or region that's absolutely nailed it, because even if they've got it right for them, that's not necessarily going to work down the road.
Yeah.
And it depends on the type of approach that they've taken as well. So back in the 80s, London had the kind of Greater London Council, I think it was, and that kind of kicked off this creative regeneration idea, and then you get to creative cities and the creative class, and I don't know how the creative community feels about it, but certainly in the academic community there's quite a lot of criticism about that, because it was just gentrifying. And then you've got things at the moment like Arts Council's scheme called Creative People and Places, which is all about going to communities and saying, well, what do you want? We can see that you don't necessarily buy tickets for venues in your area, so Arts Council language, we assume that you're not engaged, but what are you doing instead? And there's funding to support new programs that take that sort of approach. So I think it is a bit of a cop out, but it's kind of horses for courses.
Cool. Are there any? I don't know. I'm not sure if there's any others. I've got a couple of questions written down as well. Yeah. Okay. So there's the thing is, there's I don't know. Well, really, I think Matt's taken my big question out of my mouth. I think really just like a sort of if you ever. This is probably an easier question to you. Have you ever actually done the policy shaping for government as part of your research, or?
Yeah, for local authorities. So the model that I work with now as a creative ecosystem was the basis for a local authority's cultural strategy. So I think we've had a nudge to wrap things up. So I won't say too much more about it. But yes, basically.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Victoria Barker.